So, Charlie Roberts, thank you very much for joining us today for Behind the Wrestler. So, if you wouldn't mind, tell us a little bit about how you started to watch wrestling. What's your earliest memory from watching wrestling?
Yep. So, I think like most kids in New Zealand, I started watching it with tapes of WCW that used to be on at like 11 o'clock on a Friday night. I remember it used to be on after Renegade, and I remember begging my parents to stay up and let me watch Renegade. In fact, if you talk to at least most of the New Zealand wrestlers that started around we can still quote the Renegade theme. But it was actually my brother that got me into it. He's 3 years older than me, and he obviously got the wrestling bug first through school and was taping WCW off late night TV, and then I sort of found it through there and straight away was just hooked on it. And it just grew from there. It was stalking out the local video stores and digging through every wrestling VHS they had, back when tapes were still a thing. And then, it was through there we were lucky to have a really good video store at the time that had, I remember they had one ECW tape, they had WCW tapes, they had WWF tapes, and it was just everything I could get my hands on, and it became what I just watched religiously and started taping it religiously. That's pretty much how it all started.
So from being a child, you obviously had a great love of watching wrestling, and then you went on to become a reporter for NJPW. How did that all come around?
Yeah, so I guess most kids grow out of the wrestling bug. I still say now I'm the kid that never did. And so, going through high school and things like that, you sort of shut up about liking wrestling because it's not the cool thing. And then I found NZPWI by, I think I was searching something on the internet for New Zealand wrestling, and it popped up. And so I joined up there on the forums, which is pretty much where it was where anyone in New Zealand wrestling at the time was. And then a vacancy came up for a Wellington scene reporter, and at this point I'd seen IPW at Wellington Armageddon once. I think it was the first time they did it, and I remember it because that was the show where the ring broke, and Martin Sterling, who, if you're anyone in New Zealand wrestling, Marty, started throwing chairs under the ring to fix it. And that image has always stuck with me. But I sort of emailed Dion McCracken, who ran the site at the time, and said, look, I'm interested in doing it. And he said, great, send me through a writing sample. So I sent it through, and then a couple of weeks later, the rest was history. I went to my first NZWPW show, which I believe was Eruption, just when the old reporter was finishing up. Met him there, and so began the great journeys of my old man having to ferry me out to Lower Hutt Town Hall on a Friday night, and then picking me up after, and then going home and having to type up these reports and getting them online.
So with being an NZPWI reporter and travelling to the Wellington shows, how did you find you were received at the shows? Were the wrestlers and the promoters, were they welcoming to you? Were they standoffish of having a reporter there, or how did that work?
No, look, there was never anything like that. At the time down there, you had a couple of really interesting personalities on the scene. I remember one who came up to me first show and sort of handed me this. He had obviously just printed this piece of paper off on his home computer and put it in a lanyard, and handed it to me saying that was my press pass, which I sort of laughed at and thought, oh boy, are you serious? But no, look, I mean, most of the guys there, I was the same age as them, a couple of years younger. So when I sort of first got talking to them, which was actually at Oh, I mean, at the time, I was just the kid that reported. No one actually knew who I was. I met a couple of them, but didn't really sort of get to know them until a couple of years into it when I was at university with most of them, so my first year. But that was when the WWE first came on the Road to WrestleMania 22 tour, I think it was at Westpac Stadium. And there was sort of a function that NZPWI or Dion had put on before that. And that was where I met a lot of them. And I remember playing pool with Slade Mercer, as he's now known, or Max Damage, as he was known at the time, after the show in this bar, and we just got talking from then, and that's sort of where that bond grew, and sort of the rest was history from there.
So that the Road to WrestleMania 22 tour, for people who haven't seen the video of it, there's an awesome part where you're shouting and having a go at Finlay.
Yeah.
And obviously you're a little bit smaller than you are now.
A lot smaller.
So can you explain just about the feeling of you're leaning over the barricade shouting at a wrestler who's quite a bit bigger than you, and what was going through your mind?
Beer.
During that?
Beer was what was going through my mind. There wasn't a lot. I mean, that was just a insane experience, that whole show. And I was fortunate enough to be sitting ringside for my first ever WWE show and the first ever show they did here. And looking back at it now, I'm sure if I went back and rewatched the show, I'd look at it with a different eye. But at the time, it was just still being this massive wrestling fan, never seen it live before. You're going to be front row for it. And you're seeing guys that you've wanted to see for years live. Was really cool. And beer was going through my head when I was yelling that out.
So from being an NZPWI reporter, you then transitioned into being a referee for KPW. So how did that work? Did KPW approach you? Did you start training? Explain that process for me.
Yep. So after that show, and I guess for a couple of the WPW shows beforehand, I've been sitting there thinking, some of these guys aren't that much bigger than me. I mean, at the time I was probably lucky to be 65 kgs soaking wet. And so I remember sitting there thinking, these guys aren't that much bigger than me, and obviously you're hanging around talking to them. And the night of that WWE show, I got talking to Slade Mercer a little bit more and said, just thinking about things and having conversations about training, and I'd done martial arts for a while, and the questions started to come in my mind about, I wonder if I could give this a go. And so Wellington Armageddon was a couple of months later, and that was where I was like, actually, let's give this a go. So I talked to Slade, and he basically said, yep, come to a training. I went to my first training and loved it. And from there it sort of started to roll, and I guess it was a little bit of an awkward situation because, again, another couple of months after that is when KPW was formed. And that was formed by Rick Morgan and a guy by the name of the Punisher. They split away. They wanted to do bigger things with New Zealand wrestling that WPW at the time just had no interest in doing. And so I got a call from someone about it going, hey, do you know what this Kiwi Pro Wrestling thing is? And I had no idea, so jumped online and saw they'd posted this whole thing, and I remember looking at the guys that were leaving for it, which were guys like Slade Mercer, Johnny Juice, Inferno, H-Flame, and I remember sitting there thinking, these are the guys that I actually want to learn from. So if they're going there, then that's where I'm going to get the best training. So I remember texting, I think it was Juice, and saying, is there any way that I could get in there, or what would it be? And he gave me Punish's number. So I texted him and he said, yep, happy to have you on if these guys are willing to vouch for you, which they were. The first show was rapidly approaching and I had no idea what I was doing in terms of falling or anything like that, and again, still being tiny. They sat there and said, look, we need a referee, can you do it? And I said, yep, and was then told to just turn up with a pair of dress pants and a polo shirt. And I remember that first show standing in the ring going, what the hell am I doing? But I did have a watch.
So from being a referee, I remember on the first KPW TV intro, there's a shot with you standing behind Bushwhacker Butch. So how was it being with a New Zealand wrestling legend and probably one of the most famous New Zealand wrestlers there's ever been? So how was that working closely with Butch for those kind of things?
That was insane. You learned so much from Butch. At the time he was a little bit more mobile than what he is now, obviously. But you're sort of standing in a locker room with this guy you used to watch on TV as a kid. The guy who's probably done more, than most New Zealand wrestlers up till a few years ago had ever done. He's sitting there giving you advice and saying, this is what you should be doing. When you do this, try doing this instead. And it's the same thing with Rip Morgan. Those were two guys, I guess, that we were very lucky to have who had been to the US. They'd danced under those lights of the NWA and the WWF. They'd ridden the roads. They knew the stories. They knew what it took to make a living doing it. It was just invaluable. And also they, at the time, were bringing in all these former New Zealand legends to come in, and also they'd drop into training and say, well, this is what you should be doing, try doing this, and it just accelerated your training so much. And obviously, the business has moved on from the days where a suplex was a finish. But the lessons these guys taught you about, what you do, how to do it, when to do it, they're things that have stuck with me the whole time.
So, could you explain a little bit about the, I believe there's a crooked referee storyline that KPW used, and how that got pitched to you, what the storyline was and what the end result of that was?
Yep. I remember at one training, Punisher came up to me and said, this is what we sort of want to start doing, and we see you moving away from being a referee to more of a managerial role. And I said, that's great, what about wrestling? It was, let's take it one step at a time. So the original idea was to put me with a wrestler at the time called The Ram. And he was feuding with a guy called Creed. So the angle there was basically, these guys are having a series of matches and the Ram's constantly cheating, but I'm catching Creed and thinking Creed's the one cheating. So little things like, I remember one match they had where the Ram was going to throw powder in Creed's face and Creed blew it back in Ram's face. The referee turns around and I see it all over Ram's face, so disqualify Creed, who's the good guy. And that was sort of where it was building to. And obviously circumstances at the time with KPW and just some backstage things that went on and people leaving sort of put a halt to that angle pretty quick, which led to the first sort of, I guess, debut of Charlie Roberts in the ring, which was actually against Inferno.
So that the debut of Charlie Roberts, sort of the first debut, who told you that you'd be debuting, and how was that as a match? And looking back on it now, how do you think it was for the time and for the training that you'd had?
Yeah. The reality at that time, that was my third match. I'd done a couple of matches just under various masked characters when people had needed it. but that was sort of the first one, I guess, the official debut, and it was the end of year show, and Rick Morgan had said we need to finish this angle, and so they said, look, we're going to do this with Inferno. At the time, I think the match went well. Looking back at it now, I can't actually watch it. It's so bad. I think when I look at it now, it's definitely someone's been watching too many manager versus wrestler matches. It's painful, and that one stays. I don't think too many people have ever seen that match, which is probably for the best. But looking back at it, it was a good start. I couldn't have asked for anyone better. I think to wrestle against Inferno's always been a guy that was on my list to wrestle, and never really got the chance once I was at a level where I could actually go. But yeah, looking back at it now, it's cringeworthy. Just everything from the ring gear to everything in that match, really.
You mentioned ring gear. What was the ring gear that you had?
So again, it was being small. I didn't feel comfortable without wearing a shirt, so there was a custom-made t-shirt there, and these absolutely god-awful silver lame pants, which at the time I thought were great. But looking back at it now, it looked like your stereotypical indie wrestler pants, just these horrible baggy silver things, which photos do exist of, but I can safely say those pants got destroyed.
So after your debut, the sort of half debut, the first debut of Charlie Roberts, where did you go from there? Did you go back to being a manager? Did you carry on wrestling on shows, or where was the next stop?
So the plan was to carry on and wrestle, but unfortunately, as things do, I had blown my knee out a couple of months earlier. So that match was in December of 2006, and I blew my knee out probably around August, September, and was told by the physios at the time, do your exercises, it'll all be fine, and you'll be back to normal. Of course, you do them for a couple of weeks and everything feels fine, so it's like, great, I'll just go back to it. Then a couple of weeks after that match, I blew my knee out again, and then about a month after that, while I was rehabbing it, it went a third time, and probably a couple of months after that, when I finally actually started rehabbing it properly, I was out running and got hit by a cyclist and blew my knee out a fourth time in 12 months. So that sort of required a pretty major knee surgery. That was a full ACL reconstruction, and that was being told, forget running, wrestling is definitely out of the question, you're not going to be able to do anything, you'll be lucky to sort of get back into being able to run after this, which sort of put the kibosh on any wrestling, but to Rip's credit, he wanted to keep me involved and introduced me as a manager, so I actually started managing Inferno in a really roundabout storytelling way, where I'd convinced Inferno to turn evil and join me as a bad guy. And that time, even though I couldn't wrestle and was actually in a splint for most of that year, which people couldn't see behind this red suit that I was wearing, was actually some of the most fun, because it was still learning, and the benefit, I think, of being a manager and a referee and actually starting wrestling in those sort of roles is you learn so much being in the ring with good workers and with bad workers. You pick up on what the good workers do, you pick up on what the bad workers do, and all of that just goes into a mental Rolodex. So when I did sort of finally get back into wrestling, it was more a case of, okay, so ring positioning's this, these guys do this, and it was just picking all that stuff up. I guess by osmosis.
So, obviously with the knee injury, you were out. How long were you out for?
It was about 18 months all up, if I totaled it up.
Wow. So then, when you went back to training, can you explain that process? How long it took? Was there any circumstances people have said to you, look, you shouldn't be wrestling. You've got a knee or had a knee injury, so we can't have you wrestle. And
I've lost count the amount of people that said that. And going back to training was a real tentative thing for me, just because I was scared that I'd blow it out again, or it'd pop and something would go wrong, and then it's back in surgery and just not fun. So at the time, obviously, we had Graham Hughes, yourself, overtraining, and that whole time I was out, I just remember going to every training and not wanting to miss anything, and again learning. So those first couple of sessions back, I was real tentative and protective about my knee, and sort of real hesitant to do things. And there's one training that still sticks out in particular, I think, where I was all ready to go, and then right before training I was like, no, I can't do it because of my knee. And I remember Shane Sinclair at the time going, but you've got everything on, like, why don't you just do it? And I did, and that sort of started it, and sort of got the confidence back in, and started rolling from there, I guess. But that whole time people were saying you need to stop, but it was stuff that I'd heard since day one. First it was, you're too small, you just don't get it. After the knee injury, it became a thing of, well, you're injury prone, so we can't have you in there. And that was really hard to hear when, after probably a good solid year of training and working at it, 2-3 times a week, and you've got some of the top guys in the country at the time saying, you should be wrestling, and being told, no, we can't have you on a show because it's too risky. If you get hurt, that's us. It's you. It destroys the show. And that was a long fight uphill for probably another 18 months. And it actually took Shane Sinclair, Fetu, and Jay Diamond actually going to the promoter and saying, Rob will be fine, he's better than most of the people you're putting on, just give him the shot. I don't think even they know that I know that, because ironically I wasn't at the training where that happened. But I remember getting phone calls about that and saying, look, these guys all vouched for you, and the rest sort of from there just sort of went with it.
So that's sort of the second debut match, when you got a chance to really show what you could do, and the training and the hard work that you put in over the last couple of years, it would have been at that point. Who was that match against? And did you get any feedback at the time from the promoter and the booker of KPW, who maybe you proved them wrong, and so on and so forth? Yeah,
so that particular match was against a guy called The Brute, who, he didn't exactly have the best reputation. He knew how to get a reaction from a crowd, and had this fantastic character of, this unstable sort of guy, but definitely wasn't playing with a full deck. And that match went as well as it could. When I got back, everyone was like, that was really good. There's always stuff to work on, obviously, but I think that one sort of proved that, look, you can actually do this without dying. And then from there I started sort of getting these matches, bringing new people out of the school. At the time KPW had a school where we had quite a few guys coming through, and I would generally be their first match in just a 3 to 4 minute squash. And I remember wrestling Terry the Golden Greek, and that match taught me a lot just because of his limitations. He definitely had a view on himself, and wrestling him was an interesting experience, but it taught me a lot about what I never want to be in wrestling and what I never wanted to do. And I think the one that really sort of turned a corner was against Mr. Samoa, who was about 6'4" and about 100 plus kgs, and wrestling him, and just sort of, you're dealing with this guy that's so much bigger than you. And I remember coming back and the promoter going, that was perfect, I couldn't have asked for better. And sure enough, the next show you sort of start getting these longer matches to prove yourself, and once you know that you can actually work and get a reaction from the crowd, that's sort of where the trust comes from. And it's a two-way thing.
So from there, I remember you had I think it was a best of 3 series with Wild Wills.
Yep.
And I remember seeing, I think it was the middle one at Fan Appreciation Night.
That was the first one.
The first one.
Yeah.
And I remember somebody who hadn't seen you wrestle or work for a year and change at that point, being really impressed with the progress that you'd made. And obviously you started to get a lot of feedback from promoters and bookers, and even if it's just within KPW itself. Did you know from the outset that that you and Wild Wills would be a feud, and it would had you guys planned to make the matches these sort of show stealing matches, or how did those come around?
No, look, I think we never planned for it to be a feud. At the time KPW was doing 4 shows a year, so it was kind of hard to build anything on there. But I do remember that first match putting a lot of pressure on myself, to basically saying, this is your shot, don't blow it. Go out there and prove what you can do. And that's exactly what we did. Wills is still one of my favourite people to wrestle. We both had an understanding, we both trusted each other to do what we needed to do. And the match itself, I've never actually seen it back, but I just remember the crowd reaction when he finally finished it, and sort of walking in the back and people just being blown away and shaking your hand and things like that. And I guess that's sort of it's probably my personality flaw, but I'm never satisfied. And I remember sitting there thinking, if we do this again, we'll do it better. And then the second match that we had probably wasn't as good, and certainly I didn't have that same buzz after it. But then the third one that we had was fantastic, and that was where I think I felt like things had started to click with wrestling a little bit. You're actually sitting there and starting to realise, okay, so this piece goes here, but if I look back at it now, if I were to rewatch all those matches, I would probably sit there and just pick holes in them and tear them apart, because that's what you do. Wrestlers are notorious for it. You go back and watch a match from 6 months ago and you'll be picking holes in it. I don't think there's a wrestler alive that will.
So it wasn't too long after that series of matches with Wild Wills that you had your first title win. I think in KPW terms it would have been 4 shows, 5 shows, which was probably a year and a little bit.
Yep.
So it was the KPW tag belts that you won.
Yep.
So how far in advance did you know you were going to win them? Do you remember who told you were going to win them, and how you were going to win them, and how that all came about?
Yep. Shortly after that series with Wills, KPW did the first 2 shows in Tauranga, which were like these 2-day jaunts where we do 2 shows in the afternoon and then do a big evening show on the Saturday night. And the first year that we did it, I wrestled Marcus Cole, and there was a battle royal to start that show that I won to give me a title shot at any opportunity, and that was Inferno that told me that. He was booking at the time, and Rip sat me down and said, look, you're going to win this, and then you're going to be wrestling Mark that night. And Mark was someone I had wanted to wrestle for ages. You know, he'd been around the UK scene. He's so fluid in the ring to watch, and wrestling him, I still look at that match as one of my better ones, especially given the length of training time I'd had and the amount of matches I'd had at that point. I'm sure people that were backstage wouldn't have picked that to come out of my mouth. But it was one of those things as well, I think, where that match showed to me that I'm a perfectionist, and Mark certainly was too. There was one minor sort of mistake in it, and I sort of took that quite to heart, and then watching the match back was like, why? It didn't even look like it. So then flash forward a year, which I couldn't actually do much in that year because of a concussion. We got to Tauranga again, and Inferno sat me down, and Lazarus Volk, who was one of the half of the tag champs at the time, had started his own training school, which I think he called the High Wire Wrestling Academy, and I was going to be paired up with Steve Jordan, who was one of his trainees. At the time, Rip thought, we'd make a good team. We had a similar look, similar gimmick, and that we'd be going over Laz to win the belts that night. So it was Lazarus and H-Flame that were tag champs. And so we found out about that probably the Thursday beforehand. And again, that was in wrestling you keep sort of setting new first for yourself. At least I do. So when you start training, the goal is I want to have my first match. And then after you've had your first match, it becomes I want to have my first good match. And then after that, it's like I want to win a title, I want to do this, and so you keep resetting that goal. And certainly I think that tag match was good, and we obviously won the belts, and that was just I guess that was sort of a little bit of recognition, I think, for me anyway, to say actually you're doing something right with this. If they think that you can actually hold this, because I mean, in wrestling, belts are props, but it's still something where as a champion you're the one selling tickets, you're sort of the headline, the marquee sort of piece there, and you're the one that has to actually tell that story the best and be the best at what you do. So it was definitely a weird experience to win it. But I guess I didn't probably let myself enjoy it because it was sort of looking ahead already to what comes next.
So you mentioned about what comes next. So what did come next?
What came next was something which I didn't realise would be as hard, was holding those tag belts. And that's more, and once you start wrestling in tag team matches, you realise just how different it is to a singles match, or being a singles wrestler. There's a whole other element there of psychology and bringing in all these different elements of the extra two guys. How do you work that? How do you keep the crowd engaged? How do you make sure people see what they need to see? And how do you tell that story? So I was giving myself a crash course in that, and obviously having guys like Butch and Rip who spent most of their careers in tag teams, it was picking their brains constantly about, well, what about this? What about this? How do we do this? How do you actually make this stuff work? And I think a lot of people, they, both Butch and Rip, did a lot in wrestling, especially in the NWA days. I think most people obviously know Butch as a bushwhacker, and probably Rip as part of the royal family, but because they weren't sort of the main event at the time, I think people sort of forget just how much knowledge these guys have. and you certainly look back at what they did in the NWA before it became WCW, and the exposure and the TV and the psychology these guys had in tag wrestling was insane. So certainly that was what was next, was learning how to structure a tag match, how to put one together. And I remember having one in particular where it's probably about our third match as champions. And I remember we got the pin, and I just looked over at Rip, who was sitting against the wall, and he's just shaking his head. And I sort of just remember going up to him after being like, what was wrong, what didn't come off well. He laid out about 3 things in that match that sort of stuck with me since, and I'm not going to go into what they were, but those things are still rules that I apply to my matches today. And certainly I think one of the biggest things was when we actually had a tag match that he came back and was like, that was fantastic. You're getting this now, you're understanding how the psychology works, you're not just going out there trying to be a singles wrestler in a tag match, you're actually trying to be a tag wrestler. Which is something I think does make me stand out a little bit as a wrestler, and that having done tag wrestling for such a large part, and certainly starting off as a tag wrestler in the early part of my career, is that you just have this different appreciation for psychology, and I think it's a lot easier to switch back into a single psychology than it is to go to tag psychology.
So you mentioned about spending a lot of your career in tag matches, and there being obviously the differences between the psychology between a singles and a tag, and it being easier to go from tag to singles and singles to tags. So in some of the tag teams that you've been paired with guys who are less experienced. You mentioned Steve Jordan, who I think had about 2 matches beforehand. So what were some of the challenges that you faced with wrestling with some of these newer people? And obviously some of the people you were wrestling against were still newer people as well. And I won't say trainees, but maybe just sort of completed their training and just started to be on shows.
Yeah, look, I think the challenge at that time was the fact that you had all 4 of us that were still new. I was in no way what you call experienced or anything like that, not even by New Zealand standards. So I guess it was thrown in as quite a sink or swim experience, and at the time we were sort of the last match on the card, so it would be the last thing people would see, and with that came pressure, and pressure to perform. And I think I took a lot of that on myself and actively worked to sort of try and do it. But there was, looking back at those now, again, it's the blind leading the blind through a lot of it. Obviously we had the benefit of having Rip and Butch there, but I was in no way what you call experienced at that point. So I think a lot of it with those matches is sheer luck. That's what it comes back to.
So with KPW, there was a period of time when KPW looked like it was going to be around forever, and then the decision got made somewhere to stop running shows as regularly. So do you remember being told like that the training school was closing, that they were moving, and then the shows were stopping?
Yep. So I think the training school at the time, we had this great venue in Miramar in Wellington, which we had 24-hour access to. It was in sort of the middle of this industrial suburb right next to Weta Studios, and there were so many memories in that place. And I do remember the day that Rip came in and said, we're losing this. They've sold it to Peter Jackson to do what he needs to do with it. And at the time there was a whole bunch of stuff going on with TV deals and things like that had sort of fallen by the way, and at the time there was a big controversy around Manama Mao, which the guy who was producing it had basically lied to a whole lot of people, and that got pretty ugly from a court side, from the KPW side. The judgment was what the judgment was. Certainly there were no winners, I don't think, out of that. I think the end product with that was good for what it was. The guys up in IPW were certainly put in a hard position with it, and I think they did the best that they could. At the time we had that saga going on, we'd lost our training centre, and when you sort of can't train in a ring every day, that's where I think a lot of people lose their passion for it, and they sort of walk away, and just there's any number of factors that were going on, but I think the day we lost the training centre was sort of the first big one, and then that was actually in the build-up, I think, to Bushwhacker Luke coming over. It was probably about a year before that, actually. Yeah. And so losing the training centre was hard, but then we were still running shows, which is what people were still invested in. I think the problem you had was, at the time, there was a lot of politics in the New Zealand scene, and so we weren't allowed to work. KPW was the black sheep of New Zealand wrestling, for a number of reasons, some of them justified, but certainly it was one of those things where it wasn't any one of the boys doing anything, at least as far as I was aware. So we weren't actually allowed to work for anyone else. I just remember that doing people's heads in. We're doing 4 shows a year, and you're seeing guys that are wrestling 12, 13, 14, 15 times a year, and you're sort of sitting there going, well, why can't we do this? But as a company, KPW carried on. The shows did start to reduce. I think we ran 3 shows that year, and then the next year I think we ran 1, which was the last sort of Halloween Howl. And then there hasn't ever been an official word on KPW being closed, but it's coming up to 3-4 years now since the show's been run, so I think people can draw their own conclusions from that. I know they've sold the ring, so I think it is sort of just it's quite a sad end, I think, for that company, especially given that just the guys that started there, I think it was just a really cool group of guys. We all had each other's backs. It was like a family. And so if you think about it, it's quite a sad way to end it. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. Business is business, and people make the decisions they do.
So with the sort of unofficial closing of KPW, and there were lots of guys who suddenly found themselves kind of without that home base that they'd had previously. Lots of the wrestlers had kind of scattered around anyway. I think A-Flame had left at that point. Slade Mercer, who was Max Damage, had gone to Australia. So who were some of the people at that time that were still there, and kind of obviously without putting any words into people's mouth, but who were kind of now left without that home to go to? Yeah,
look, at the time you sort of still had Johnny Juice hanging around in Inferno, and I think by the time KPW actually officially shut its doors, or unofficially, officially, a lot of those guys there had sort of finished up, and probably the ones that were left were people like Blair Rhodes, Shane Sinclair, myself. Of the guys that were there for a long time, it would be those 3. The others had either moved overseas in Slade's case, or had just retired and given it up. It's one of those things where if I sit there and look at it, for me it wasn't so bad. I'd already moved to Auckland, so I sort of had started training up here, and I sort of was starting to work for more and more people, and I think it was a couple of months after I moved up that the last show was, so it wasn't anything major, I guess, from my side, but it is, one door closes, another opens, right?
So sorry to jump around a little bit, but there was a tag team match that you had on one of the Halloween Hows, I believe, which was against New Zealand wrestling legend Bushwhacker Luke.
Yep.
So obviously it's up to you whether you want to go into it too much or not, but I was just going to ask you about how the match got pitched to you. Mm-hmm. I assume that it was Rip Morgan who told you about that match, but do you remember if there's anything he said about why you're getting this opportunity to wrestle a wrestling legend, and if you want to go into anything about the match, you are more than welcome to.
Cool. No, look, that match was pitched to me, basically. It was fairly well known that Luke was coming back, and that he wanted to work all the shows. There was a New Zealand wrestling documentary being filmed, which I think is still being edited, called On the Mat. And these guys were doing stuff with Luke, and Luke wanted to do shows while he was over here, so I think he did the Armageddon Expo in Auckland, and then did an IPW show up here, then came down to Wellington, and on 1 week he was doing the KPW show, and the week after he was doing a WPW show. And so I remember Rip calling me and going, Luke's coming over, we're going to do him in the main event, and we want to do the family angle, because at the time you sort of had Cade Morgan, who was Rip's nephew, wrestling for us, and they were like, it's something that no one else can do, it's something different, so we're going to do that, and we're going to have you and a guy by the name of Jimmy Fox team up as their opponents. And look, at the time it was a huge compliment, and I think it still is, when a lot of those older guys, when they do come over, though, some of them are selective with who they work with and some aren't. And then I remember him following it up with saying, and we're going to have Terry the Golden Greek managing you. And that's where the excitement for both of us lessened a little bit. And look, I remember setting up the match. We went out and filmed this vignette of us attacking Cade Morgan. And one of those things where you sit there and it's only in New Zealand wrestling. We needed a weapon to do it, and the movie The Wrestler had just come out, and there's that scene in there where he's walking through like a dollar store or something and hitting himself over the back with things and getting his mates to do it to see what would get a good sound. And myself and Jimmy Fox went to Bunnings, which is a hardware store over here, and found a whole bunch of bamboo garden stakes. And with those and a little bit of athletic tape, we had a pretty good kendo stick. And we shot this vignette, and it took about 6 takes, and every time Rip saying, you need to hit him harder with the kendo stick. And I mean, I'm sitting there with this thing in my hand going, well, it's kind of painful. And Cade was like, just do it, it's fine. And so the last take we did, I laid into him. I've never hit someone as hard in my life, I don't think. And I remember turning it off, and it's like, oh, the coughing was such a nice touch. He's like, no, that was legit. Because I'd hit him so hard. So, at the time, that was a really cool sort of experience. And then the people that know me know what the match is. People that were at that show know what the match was. 47 minutes is all I'll say. And look, I think that match was a great learning experience for a couple of things. One, it was a chance to say that you can actually hang in there with someone. But the other thing as well is that it taught you a lesson about meeting your heroes, and that they're not always what they're cracked up to be. which is a good and a bad thing. I mean, I certainly don't regret being in the match at all, but certainly it's not ranked highly amongst my matches if I look back at it.
So again, to jump around again just a little bit, so you mentioned when you moved to Auckland from Wellington, so obviously it was personal reasons that brought you to Auckland. It wasn't anything really to do with wrestling, but then went up here, you started, for the purpose of this, I'll say assistant coaching at the Hughes Academy of Professional Wrestling. So how did you find being that assistant trainer and helping out? Because we were very, very, very small then. We didn't run shows. It was kind of, there was no guarantees, no promises for anything. So do you remember who some of the first few trainees were when you started helping teaching there? And then do you remember when we said that we were going to start running shows, and any plans that we said to you at the time that we had for that?
Yeah. So yeah, look, I mean, moving up here was different. And sort of starting, I think wrestling's been a constant in a lot of my life where there's been change, and sort of come in and for you guys to say, look, we want you to be an assistant coach straight off the bat was humbling. I still remember turning up, getting lost, trying to find where the gym was the first time I came, and I think at the time there was 4 people that were there. We had Crystal Kane, Frankie Quinn, Sticks, and his son, who were all training up here. And I remember it just being this little sweatbox of a gym in Auckland Spring, which was boiling hot for me at the time, and just coming out of there drenched every week. And look, I mean, that was a really good grounding experience, and sort of being able to just help teach people along and show them this crazy thing called pro wrestling is always a good thing. And I think having yourself, Sticks, guys that are known in Wellington definitely help make the move up easier as well. And I remember when you talked about running shows, I remember sitting there thinking, well, this was always going to happen. I remember actually prior to that, to jump around a little bit more, if we go back probably about a year before I moved to Auckland, you guys had your first show that a whole group of us flew up from Wellington for in a training weekend. And I remember thinking, you've actually got the basis of something here that's really, really cool. And so flash forward a year, and you guys said that you're going to start running shows and sort of look to do them quite regularly. And I think the first one was a charity gala at a primary school. And I still remember everything was set up, and I think I turned to and went, so what time does it start? And I remember you looking me dead in the eye and going, now. And I think there was 4 people on this field, but everyone starts from somewhere. And then I think the first show at Kelston, the Kelston Community Centre, which was a great venue, there was probably about 70, 80 people there, and as more and more shows ran there, you could see that audience starting to grow, which I thought was great, because you had a school, you had trainees coming through. Like with anything in wrestling, you get your people who turn up to 1 or 2 sessions and then never come back. But there were people there that did stick around. I mean, I remember Rebels Inc. were training there, who sort of, Maverick's obviously still knocking around the scene somewhere. But you sort of had this procession, I think, of people coming and going, but you sort of had your constants who are now getting booked across the country, which I think is testament to the work and the training.
So Hughes Academy showed in that first year was the place that gave you your first singles title. So do you remember how, obviously, which show that was, the circumstances around getting that title, and if you remember how you were told and all that?
Yep. So I can't remember exactly what the show was because they're all called Live Pro Wrestling. I think it was, I know it was around June.
September.
Okay. It's close enough. 3 months. And I mean, that show was always going to be special because at the time, my manager, who used to manage me in KPW, Alex Donahue, was flying over from Australia for it. So I was just really excited to have a boys' weekend with him. And then I remember, I think it was the Thursday beforehand, I got a message going, so you're winning the belt, this is what we want, go out there and do it. And the guys in that tournament, it was a unique tournament setup. It wasn't your standard single elimination, it was everyone wrestles everyone and there's a points system, which I think was a great concept, because it meant that there was mystery about it up till the last match. Whereas I think with single elimination tournaments, sometimes you sort of lose that aura a little bit. But if you've got a match going into it where people can wind up tied, or 3 people could be on the same amount of points, what do you do from there? That whole show, I'm really proud of the matches that I had on that show. I think the match I had with Hikaru is still one of my favourites. The match with Kate, I mean, me and Kate always had good matches together. We just sort of seemed to have this chemistry. And then the final against Tahu was fantastic, or Carrie Walker. He was a guy that I wanted to wrestle for a long time and sort of never really had the chance to do a long match with. And I think we went out there and for 2 guys that had both wrestled twice already, had a really good match that probably went for probably longer than what it should have. But certainly I remember winning that match and Chris Ferguson, the referee, handing me the belt and sort of going there, okay, now this is real. And I mean, again, as much as people talk about it, there is still a prestige, I think, associated with winning a title in wrestling. It's one thing to win a tag belt, but it's another thing to win a singles belt. And that did sort of take a moment to sink in that, hey, look, I've done this now. This is something else off the list. But then, in true Charlie fashion, it was, right, what's next?
So after the singles title when you became the first Hughes Academy champion, there wasn't really anybody at that time that we had on to shows that was in a position to take the belt off you, and the mentality of that was always, we were going to wait for somebody to be ready, or for the crowd to sort of really get behind somebody and say, we want this person to win the belt. So do you remember, obviously you held the belt for about a year, yep, give or take, so what was it like having this, people always say wrestling belts are a bit of a burden and they're the hard part, so what was it like travelling with the Hughes Academy Championship, and what were some of the challenges that you faced with that?
Yep. Biggest challenge was taking the thing through border security, airport security. You'd always see the guys looking at it closely, and then 8 out of 10 times it would be pulling it out of the bag to inspect it and see what it is. In particular with that belt, it was slightly too big to fit in my carry-on. When I had, again, first world problems, I had 2 other belts to carry with, which were the tag team belts at the time. And so I remember one flight out of Christchurch, I think, where I had all 3 of them in my bag, and the I guess the airport security guy just pulling all three of them out and sort of looking down at them and looking back at me and being like, "Oh, so you must be pretty good at this stuff then." And at 5 in the morning, I'm not the most talkative person, so I just sort of smiled and put them back in my bag and moved on. But look, I think some of the challenges at the time, I was doing what a lot of people weren't, and what a lot of people said couldn't be done with New Zealand wrestling, in terms of I was wrestling 3 or 4 times a month for 6 to 8 weeks at a time, and doing that schedule wears you down, and especially I guess my sort of mentality going into most shows is I want to hit the best match I can, I want to make people look as good as they can, and it just becomes, you sort of get on this treadmill a little bit, and I think one of the hardest things for me was with that singles bout, remembering that I had it, and working out what shows it could go on, what it could add to and what it couldn't. And I remember doing the first APW show in Christchurch with it against Ben Mana, and sort of people, that match was great, and it was sort of just, it gave me another tool to use as being that bad guy of, you get people that would announce title matches, and then being the bad guy that I am, I'd come out and go, no, there's not going to be a title match tonight, it's non-title. So you'd sort of be this conniving, cheating guy who would still, he might lose, but he's still got the title, and that just makes kids, and I think anyone in general, just gets so pissed off with people. I mean, in real life you want to see the bad guy get his comeuppance and lose everything, but here's this guy who's losing and effectively being humiliated, and at the end of the day he's still got his title. So I wouldn't say there were challenges, but it did make you have to add in extra elements to your work and things like that.
So one of the standout moments for me when you had the belt was us being told by a promoter of somewhere else, and I'm not going to name any names, that you were going to lose the belt on their show. So obviously that sort of thing doesn't normally come up very often. But do you remember that incident? Were you aware of that incident?
I remember being told about it, I think probably the day before the show, and having had no idea about it going on or anything like that, and just being like, no, that's not going to happen. And look, I think that sort of stuff, again at the time, it sort of makes you grow up in wrestling pretty quick, because you sort of have to have these conversations where, I've never been a prima donna about wrestling or anything. At the end of the day, we're all in tights pretending to fight. But, it's always that awkward conversation about, look, I can't lose. Or if I do, I'm going to do it in a way that's creative enough. And I remember that particular match where we actually came up with a finish that worked really well. And again, as the bad guy, you still lose. So the crowd see the hero go home happy, but the bad guy still got what he holds dear, which is his title in this case. And if anything, that just added more fuel to the fire the next time I went down there. So it all works out.
So moving on to when you lost the Hughes Academy Championship to Kartik, which I believe was in September, the year after you won it. So can you just talk us through the feud that you had with Kartik? It was quite a well publicised, but it was it was a feud that obviously had lasted almost a year. So just talk us through that.
Look, I mean, Kartik's one of those guys who, I remember when he first started training, there was a whole lot of stigma around him because of his condition, but I never looked at him as, here's a guy with a pacemaker. It was, here's a guy that wants to be a wrestler, and I treated him the same way I'd treat anyone else, and that led to some interesting conversations about why we'd done certain things in matches. But look, I mean, I trusted him to know his limits like I do with anyone else, and that feud, I think, for me is something I'm really proud of in terms of seeing how far he developed through those matches. And I remember having the conversation. I think the original plan at the time was to have him win the belt on the last show of the year, and I remember having a conversation with you and saying, no, we need to do it now. He's ready, the crowd's there. Because I guess that's the thing when you're wrestling in front of the same people every month. It's different obviously if you're touring around and you've got national TV exposure like the WWE, but I remember saying that crowd was at a point where they wanted to see him win, and if we dragged it out any longer they'd turn on it. And so I remember going into that September match, it was kept really closely guarded that I would be losing the belt. I don't think I even told Carter, because I remember we went out there and had probably one of the best matches that we'd had, and it sort of went all over the place, and the crowd were there, and I remember the reaction when he hit me with the spear for the last one, and I remember telling him congrats as he's pinning me, which I found out later he didn't hear a word of what I was saying to him in the match, which is why he looked so surprised. And just hearing that reaction when he won, that's what made it for me. It's hearing those sort of reactions when you can elicit that sort of response from people where they actually forget that wrestling's fake, for lack of a better word. They forget that it's all predetermined, but they actually get lost in the moment and they react that loudly to it. That's the sort of stuff that I really enjoy. And I think looking back at that feud, even the return match that we had the following month, even then those ones, and every time we've wrestled since, I think we just sort of keep clicking and pushing that boundary more.
So there was a time, probably around that sort of time, where you were easily the busiest wrestler in New Zealand, and at the time I believe it was still IPW you weren't wrestling for, at least not on a regular basis, and then you got I don't know if it was a message or a call about being in the Eliminator, which I believe was the same year, 2016 or 2015 one. So do you remember, obviously you had the busiest schedule out of everybody, but there was still that missing piece from the schedule, which was the IPW dates. So do you remember getting the phone call or the message, how that came about, who asked you to be on the show, and what it was like sort of filling in that missing piece?
It was just sort of a message a little bit out of the blue. I mean, everyone's friends in wrestling. At least I seem to think so. I tend to get on with most people, and when that first message came through, I remember thinking, oh, this is cool. And as we went in and did that show, and it was really clear that, look, there's no guarantee of anything more from this. It's just, this is what it is. And then I remember there was a message about doing the Armageddon that year, and the Auckland Armageddon, where they needed some help, and so went along and did that. And I guess it's just sort of the ball kept rolling from there, and the momentum sort of picked up around. I think my work stands for itself, and having that missing piece was something really cool. But I remember probably a little bit before that, I think I was talking with someone who started within the same year, and within 7 months they'd worked every promotion in New Zealand, and it took me 7 years, which is look, that's a testament as to where New Zealand wrestling is now and how far it's come. from the bullshit days where you were working 4 times a year. Now there's opportunities out there for guys who can work every weekend if you want, and I like to think that probably I played a part in that, in terms of moving to Auckland and sort of saying, well, I'm going to work for the Hughes Academy, I'm going to work for Maniacs, I'm going to grab whatever company I can work for, and travelling down, working for WPW, working for APW, working for SPW, and now with the IPW piece in there as well, you've got this huge momentum just building with New Zealand wrestling, and I think it's never been a better time to be a New Zealand wrestler, especially for the guys coming in now. They don't necessarily know how hard people have worked to get it to that stage.
With working for everybody now, which obviously a few years ago wouldn't have been a reality, what are some of the challenges that you've come up with, whether it's sort of the almost simple things of having a busy road schedule and being away every weekend, to challenges wrestling on all these different shows, variety of wrestlers and so on and so forth?
Yep. Well, certainly that's probably the biggest one, is trying to have a life. You sort of work during the week, and then you've got to fit in the gym, the training, and then your weekends, your Saturdays are normally taken up travelling to a show, and if the show's out of town, you're normally on a early morning flight, and your life sort of becomes this cycle of fake tans and flying, is what I dubbed it to someone the other day. And that you sort of get home, generally I'll be on a red-eye flight home the next day on the Sunday, and that's like your day to sort your life out. Jumping in planes after you've wrestled is never the ideal recovery space. So you sort of do the show, you jump on a plane and you come home, and then you sort your life out, you pack your bag again for next weekend and check as to where you're going to be, whether or not you've got to drive 2-3 hours, or you're just driving across the city, or you're flying for an hour, flying for 2 hours. That's probably the hardest challenge, I think. But in terms of challenges around it in general, I don't necessarily see them as challenges. If I don't like wrestling, I would say they're challenges. The schedule does wear you down after a while, but I think in terms of the challenges of wrestling new people and things like that, I wouldn't say there's too many challenges with that. I look at those as opportunities and just a really good chance to wrestle people who haven't wrestled before and just build that experience up. It's a good thing now that you can do that, because I remember when it was wrestling 4 times a year, you'd have a bad match and you'd dwell on it for 3 months. Whereas now, if you have a bad match, or you have something in a match that doesn't go quite as right, you have to shake it off within a week, or in some cases overnight, because you've got to go wrestle the next day, or you've got to wrestle the next weekend, so you don't sort of get the time to dwell. And again, I mean, the experience here is invaluable. That was probably the biggest thing that was holding Kiwis back from a global stage, is that lack of ring experience because of the lack of schedule. But now, if you're there, you can wrestle almost every weekend now, which is insane.
So with some of the places that you've been to in wrestling, you have undoubtedly the busiest schedule for wrestling out of anybody. I think there's a couple of that have become close to the amount of dates, and I even believe it was 5 or 6 weekends off.
Yep.
You had last year,
4 or 5, yeah.
which for New Zealand is pretty insane and pretty unheard of. So going to some of the Christchurch shows that you've done for APW and Aftershock Pro Wrestling, you had a feud with Jax Casey. So what are your memories surrounding that? Again, did you know it was going to be a feud beforehand? Who told you about all those matches? And it kind of culminated in the crowning of their first heavyweight champion, which is sort of the final part of the feud after your submission match that you had. So can you walk us through the timeline of you and Jax, Casey, and all that?
So again, it's one of those things that was never intended to be a feud. I just remember asking the guys down there to say, hey, look, I want to work with some of you guys and new opponents, and Jax came up and we did a little thing in their Southern Stampede, and that sort of built to the submission match that we had, and that came off really well. I remember with that match being quite worried about it going in because you had a hardcore match right before it, and submission matches by their nature are very methodical. They're a little bit slower paced. There's nothing overly flashy or flying from the top rope about them. And if you watch that match back, the crowd are there the whole way through, and we told the story through the match, which I think came off really well. And then that led to the street fight that we had, which I think shows real faith from any booker or company when they sit there and put you in a main event. And that match was, I'm proud of it. There was a really close call in it in terms of an errant kendo stick shot, which got me in the neck. And I remember hearing that hit and then lying on the mat being like, can I wiggle everything? Am I concussed? Have I broken my neck? What is going on? And I think that's, again, the unique thing with wrestling, right? In no other sport do you sit there and have that split-second decision and think about that. They stop it. Things get stopped. Wrestling, that doesn't happen. But we had that match, which then built to our final match, I guess, which was a 2 out of 3 falls, which sort of played off the history that we'd had. And again, that match, there's things that I'm really proud of, and I think the more you wrestle someone, the more you click, the more you start gelling with their style, and you know what works for them, what they can do, what their limitations are, and how to work around them. And then obviously December last year we had the crowning of the champion, and certainly that feud's not over by a long stretch. You've sort of got now this platform to go whichever way you want to with it.
So you mentioned about injuries and wrestling not really giving you time off, and injuries that can occur, and kind of having to work through them and fight through them. So what are some of the injuries that you've faced? I know you mentioned a concussion, and how do those injuries come around?
Yeah, so I've been pretty lucky, touch wood, over the years. There was my knee, obviously, when I started, and there was a concussion that I got in training, which I still don't remember a week of 2012 because of that concussion. I remember apparently I landed on the back of my head, got up, carried on training. I remember going out to the car after training, putting my key in the door and saying maybe I'm not okay, and then the next thing is about 3 days later and I'm waking up at my parents' house. And apparently I slept for 3 or 4 days just as my brain resets. And I was really lucky with that to not have any long-lasting effects or anything at all for what was I think the severest grade concussion you can get. So I don't know why I didn't. I'm not going to question it. I'm just going to run with it. But yeah, I've been lucky in that I haven't had anything serious, at least not from wrestling. I popped a rib head weightlifting. Didn't realise that I'd popped it until I was wrestling, and went to do something with my arm and felt this really sharp pain, and went to the doctor after, and they were like, oh, this is what you've done. And then I've only had the amount of aches and pains you get when you wake up the next day is always interesting when you sit there and try and piece how you did this, or how you got this bruise, or where that came from. But yeah, I've been lucky. In terms of wrestling directly causing injury, probably just the concussion, the knee, and a case of whiplash. That's about it.
So onto a little bit more of a positive note, other than injuries. You've been in the ring with some of New Zealand's like best wrestlers. Especially the last couple of years, you've been sort of on the top of the ladder in most places. And with that, you've had the opportunity to wrestle some of the legends that come over. IPW bring over some legends for IPW for when they do the Armageddon shows. So you had a match recently where you had your hair cut by Brutus Beefcake.
Yeah.
So again, do you remember how that came around? Who told you? Was it a day of thing, or did you know beforehand? And how was that as well?
Yeah, I mean, look, that was a day off thing. That was just something where we need someone to do this, and I sort of said, yeah, I'll do it. You know, it's not something that everyone can say they've had done. It's probably not something everyone wants to say they've had done. But, you know, again, it's the thing with meeting those legends and sharing locker rooms with them is it's a really cool experience because, you know, you're meeting these guys you watched growing up, the guys that have done it, and it's an invaluable chance to pick their brains. But I think probably the bigger thing for me from the last couple of years is being able to wrestle some of the top guys that are either coming up or are on top at the moment. So, you know, there's a huge amount of talent in New Zealand wrestling, and there's more coming through. You know, it's being able to wrestle guys like your James Shaws, your Marcus Coles, you know, your Kardicks that are coming up, the Deadly Sins from SPW that are coming up through the rankings, Hustler. There's so much talent coming through. Your Rough Guts, who've been on top for years, your Chad Howards, you know, your Graham Hughes and things like that. Those guys that have been round and they've been on top for a while, and now you've got this younger crop coming through, and these guys who are just starting out, they have all the potential and are just so talented in the ring. Yeah, New Zealand wrestling's in such a strong place, and I think for me, you know, definitely meeting the legends and sharing a ring space with them is great, but I think probably the bigger thing for me over the last couple of years has been seeing just the sheer level of talent New Zealand wrestling has coming through.
So with some of the New Zealand talent that you have been lucky to work with, you have a feud that's still at this moment, where are we, January the 10th of 2017, you're in the middle of a feud with the Friends in Similar Tights or Fist. So can you just go through the timeline of that feud? I know there was recently a match that you have been especially proud of, and a storyline arc as well with that.
Yeah, so like, I mean, the Fist storyline that we've been working through, you know, those two guys again are just two exceptionally talented wrestlers. You know, and they provide a nice complement to the tag team and myself and Curtis Castlewood, and you know, I think the four of us all have very similar outlooks on wrestling, and we've probably been feuding now for coming up on probably just shy of a year. And you know, you've got four guys that have a very similar mindset that all want to go in and do the best that we can and sort of try and steal the show, and you know, it's having this arc and these things that you can actually sink your teeth into, and once you start getting a reaction from fans who buy into it, it just amplifies it that much more, and you know, you start getting people booing you the second your music hits, as opposed to needing to warm up to it. You know, they're recognising you, they know the arc and things like that, and certainly the matches we've had with those guys have all been great. Certainly the last one, I think, is again, it's just that one's going to stand out for me, and I think that's just again a product of you know, the more you work with people and the more you stick with them, you learn their quirks, you learn the timings, you learn where you need to be for their things, and it just flows naturally from there.
Recently, New Japan Pro Wrestling and Sakura Events did a on the mat show in Auckland, and surprise from a lot of people was New Zealand's favourite wrestler Charlie Roberts was on the card for that show. So obviously it wasn't a advertised thing. So I sort of in two different parts. Can you go through how you found out you'd be wrestling, who it was who told you you'd be wrestling, and sort of the everything to do with that, the feelings, what you did after you found out, and then on the actual day, the process of turning up to the venue and finding out who you're going to wrestle, and then the actual match itself.
Yep. So I think with that whole Sakura Events show, it's still surreal to describe it. I sort of found out probably about 8 p.m. the night before that I was going to be doing it, which I think is a good thing because it meant I didn't have time to wind myself up about it and freak out, or as much time. There it was sort of a case of, okay, you just go home, you go about your normal pre-show routines, and then came the time to turn up to the venue at 9 the next day, and there was myself, Paul Sayers and Marcus Cole, who were the three sort of Kiwi guys on the card. And I think there was a point where me and Paul just sort of sat there and looked at it with the ring set up, the chairs out, and just going, how the hell did two kids from Wellington get to this point? The guy I was wrestling, John Strongman, is a really, really cool dude, quite possibly the largest human being I've ever seen. And we sort of sat there and talked through what we wanted to do, and how the specific thing was going to play out, because obviously there was an advertised match already for him. So I was sort of the unannounced opponent, and I still remember standing at the bottom of the stairs at the entrance ramp as he's doing his promo, saying if anyone back there has the nuts to come out and fight me, and then hearing the opening bars of my music playing, you could almost hear the crowd go, "Wah!" And then when that hook hit and my name flashed up, and hearing that reaction, both from the New Zealand wrestlers in the crowd that obviously twigged straight away, and some of the fans that go to the local shows actually realising what was going on, that's something that's going to stick with me for a long time. It's just the goosebumps on the arm and standing there and just taking that moment in. And I think you can see it on the footage. I sort of take a couple of steps and then just pause and let that moment hit. And the match I was really happy with. It's sort of the biggest stage to date that I've wrestled on, and it was just still a surreal experience. And if I look back at it, it's like, okay. But again, now it's like, what's next? Certainly I think that's probably the one time in wrestling where I've actually stopped and actually enjoyed a moment for a couple of days after and before thinking what's next. But there's always that in the back of your head of what's next, what's the next big thing, where do you go from here, where do you move on to. So
thinking about where we're moving on to now, as of when this is being filmed, in a couple of weeks' time you have the tabled match with Fist at IPW Coastal Assault. So trying to kind of predict the future, what are you hoping from that match? This interview doesn't get put up till March, but what are you hoping that match is going to have been?
I think the goal with that match is to steal the show, and sort of I think show people that tag wrestling still has its place. I mean, certainly globally outside of Japan, really tag wrestling's fallen off a little bit. You've obviously got it in Japan and Mexico, but I think there's the art of it's being lost a little bit, and that's sort of what I want to do with this match is actually just show to people that, hey, look, you know, you can go out there and actually have a great tag match, and leave people stunned and breathless and all that other good stuff, which is what sort of the aim is. But I guess in terms of where to from here, and you know, I was always told in wrestling to always be ready and always grab opportunities when they come up. Don't wait for opportunity to come to you, go out there and find it. And I think certainly this year, 2017, that's what I'm looking to do. There's a couple of things I'm working on, and sort of just increasing that profile a little bit more, and unfortunately I can't say too much about them at this stage, but I'm sure by the time this is out, some of them will already be in play. And look, I think, it's the Sakura Events thing just proves that when opportunities do come up, you just need to grab them. There was no hesitation in grabbing that. I know I was second guessing myself before that match, but you've got to grab these opportunities and make the most of them, and that's wider than wrestling. I think that's just in life in general.
So sort of as we're starting to be on like the wrapping up of this episode, I normally ask people what their favourite matches have been, but I'm going to change it slightly for you because you've quite frankly wrestled everywhere and wrestled everyone. So I'm going to ask you for some of your favourite matches from specific companies, just to try and make sure that we kind of cover most of the bases, because obviously you've wrestled for everybody in the country. I don't think that anybody in the country that runs that you haven't wrestled for, and pretty much every show that there is you're on, or you were on the last one, or you're on the next one. So we'll start off with KPW. So your favourite match from your KPW days?
Probably the match I had with Marcus Cole, the Bays WrestleFest, just because that was sort of the first one where I sort of sat there and I learned a lot out of that match, and it's still up there as one of my favourites.
So from NZWPW.
There's probably two. One would be the Battle Royal that I was in on the show that they had Bushwhacker Luke in, which seems like a strange one, but that was sort of the first time they'd actually asked anyone from KPW to be on a show, and so that was just a nice feeling to actually be able to go into that locker room and actually be invited there and sort of hopefully start opening that door a little bit more. And then the other one would have to be against James Shaw and Jade Priest and Hayden Thiel, who at the time were the WPW Tag Team Champions. And that was partly just because it was wrestling alongside two of my best mates, and Chad Howard and Bryanton. That was the night that we actually won the WPW Tag Team titles, which again is another sort of big thing that we never thought would happen from not being NZWPW guys. And it also meant that between Chad and I, we became one of the few Triple Crown sort of champions. So that was just they probably hold more sentimental value than wrestling value. But
so APW.
APW, there's the match I had with Hustler, where we went for 35 minutes, and probably the 2 out of 3 falls match that I had with Jax. I think that one was really, it just tied everything together that we wanted, and probably the 6-man tag that we had down there against Kingston Eclipse, Ben Mana and Aaron Henry with the three of us being myself, Bryant and Chad Howard as Rodeo Drive. That was just something that, again, it was the crowd were there, the match was put together really well, and everything just came off the way we wanted it to. So
cool. So from Maniacs United.
There's probably so again, there's probably two there. One would be against Paul Sayers, and I'm going to cheat here and say probably any of the times I wrestled him last year for Maniacs. They were just fun matches, and I think again it was two guys with points to prove. I think the only thing that I'd change about them would be being lawn darted into a wall, which is not my smartest idea. But probably that, and then also if I look back further, probably again it's another tag match, which was Brian to myself against Sticks and Bull Adams, where we again that was just like the old times. It was basically 4 KPW guys just going out there and having fun, and putting on a really good match.
So from IPW.
IPW, there's been a few. Wrestling James Shaw one-on-one was, that's always a good match. It's something I always look forward to. And certainly I would say the match I had with Brooke Duncan at one of the Armageddons last year, I think it was Manukau Armageddon, it was really good. It was my first time wrestling Brooke one-on-one. And then probably the most recent match that we had with Fist at Nightmare Before Christmas. There's a real tag thing coming through here. And that match was just, I'd probably put it in one of my top 5 matches ever, that one. So,
well, so from SPW.
SPW again, I'd probably put the match with James from SPW's first show that we had there. That was just a fun match. It's the only word for it. And probably again the match we had with Deadly Sins, either the first or the second. It's probably pretty hard to choose, but I'm going to go with the second one, just because the story there was told, and again, if you look at reactions, certainly the reaction that they got to winning was something special.
And then finally from the Hughes Academy.
Yep. So as I mentioned before, the match I had with Hikaru to win the title is definitely up there. The match I had against Steve Jordan was really good. I'm really happy with that one. Just again, it was a chance to lock horns with an old friend. And to pick a match that I've had with Kartik is really hard, but I'd say probably the match where he won the title and the rematch immediately after, and also probably the 4-way title match that we had the end of the 2016. That match is up there as well.
Cool. So the sort of the almost last question before the last question. Do you have any regrets in wrestling?
I try not to. There's always going to be what if questions. But look, I think you make a decision for a reason, and you run with that decision. So no, I think any of the decisions that I've made today, I can sort of stand by and hold true to. I guess just there's no such thing as regrets, I don't think. Regrets are only there if you let them be. So
And then finally, is there where can fans and admirers get hold of you? So social media outlets, etc.
So through Facebook, which is Charlie Roberts Wrestler, Instagram, which is CRobPWNZ. They're the two big ones that I use to get in touch with. Any of the companies, so the Hughes Academy, SPW, both have their on-demand services, which you can download and see me in action on. Social media is the big one, and coming up around the country, if there's a wrestling show in your town, I'm probably going to be on it. I think the first couple of matches this year are obviously for IPW coming up, PWE, and APW, and obviously the Hughes Academy. So,
well, thank you very much, Charlie Roberts, for sitting down on this hour and 40-minute behind the wrestler interview. Very much appreciate you coming and chatting.
Fantastic, thanks.